Thank you for coming. And of course, as what Lucas said, it is wonderful to have everyone here. And I think life, very much like art, goes on. So it's wonderful to have everybody here today and to have a discussion about this exhibition, Suddenly Turning Visible. So we're going to talk about how we are thinking about this whole curatorial panel. We thought we should talk about the curatorial processes because that's usually invisible to you. You see the final product in the case, which is the exhibition itself, but not the kind of curatorial processes or the exhibition making processes. So this is what we're going to focus today. And because we have such a small setting, which is also intimate and wonderful, we welcome your questions. And I think it's okay for us if you can just ask your questions, interject us, even if you like, and we'll be happy to take your questions. And you don't have to wait till the end, before you ask the question. So just feel free to ask at any point in time. So besides the curatorial processes, we thought we should then start with how this exhibition came about. And this is often a question that's asked, not just to artists, but also curators. Right? You ask artists, so what is your inspiration? Where do you get it? Well, the curatorial can be inspirational at times too. But in this case also, we were very kind of strategic and clear in how we wanted to develop this exhibition in relation to the other exhibitions that we are also kind of thinking about within the National Gallery Singapore as well. So I'll just start off by talking about the broader kind of research processes that the National Gallery Singapore is doing. This kind of exhibition, like Suddenly Turning Visible, is very different from, say, our level 3 changing exhibitions in the Singtel gallery spaces, whereby we usually have our blockbuster exhibitions. So here, in the Concourse galleries, due to the nature of the space itself, being a double volume space, enables us to be more flexible in how we think about how we can curate our exhibitions. So one of the earlier exhibitions, I'm not sure if some of you might remember, was A Fact Has No Appearance, whereby we looked at comparative artistic practices that were conceptual and kind of played with the idea of destruction in the 1970s. So they looked at 3 artists, Reza Piadasa from Malaysia, Tan Teng Kee from Singapore, and Johnny Manahan from the Philippines. And there was a kind of comparative research exhibition that is key to our understanding of the region, which we call Southeast Asia. So this exhibition, in a way, follows from that trajectory of research exhibitions that are comparative. And for Suddenly Turning Visible, we were looking at comparatively the institutional histories of Southeast Asia. In this case, the Birasri Institute of Modern Art in Bangkok, the Alpha Gallery in Singapore, and the Cultural Center of the Philippines in Manila. So this type of comparative exhibitions helps us to look at the region and to construct art historical research that is comparative, to draw kind of connections that we are looking at, be it art institutional histories or kind of histories of diverse artistic practices. But it also enables us to construct, in a way, these connections that also exist. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that as well, as we look comparatively within the region. So maybe I'll pass on to Moose. Maybe Moose can share with how this exhibition came about as well.
Thanks, Eugene. So just to kind of pick up on some of the things that Eugene mentioned. On the one hand, the exhibition is a kind of a comparative perspective on what happened in 3 cities in the 1970s, right? So there was Bangkok, Manila, and Singapore. But the exhibition really started sometime in 2014, maybe even a bit earlier than that, when I was in Penang and talking to one of the architects that we focus on in this exhibition as well, Lim Chong Keat. Now, Lim Chong Keat is a kind of a pioneer architect who operated in Singapore and Malaysia throughout the 1950s and 1960s, built some of the most important structures that are today gazetted as national monuments. One such structure that we look at is the Singapore Conference Hall, which still stands along Shenton Way in the Central Business District. And essentially, the conversation sort of revolved around a kind of a question, I suppose, that he asked me. He said, so, I hear that you're building a new museum in Singapore. what kind of an institution or institutionality do you want to create? How does one go about building this, something that remains relevant for this time, right? Which is our time, right? This moment that we are seated in right now. And frankly, I mean, I was a little bit younger too, and I didn't have a very prompt response. And then he offered the example of something that he and his generation had thought about and done in the 1970s. And he began to talk about this space called the Alpha Gallery, which had been sort of a meeting point, not just for artists, but also for architects, for poets, for free thinkers, for individuals who later went on to become diplomats and museum directors and so on and so forth. But essentially individuals in their 20s and their 30s trying to make sense of what to do in the aftermath of colonialism, right? Because Singapore becomes independent in 1965. And essentially the question arises, like, how is one going to live in these newer times? And perhaps a lot of those questions resonated. And we initiated an internal discussion amongst ourselves to really try and think of whether there were other such instances that emerged during the 1970s, which enabled us to think about institutions and institutionalities in a much more kind of a dynamic manner. And the more we started to think about it, we realized that there were other examples out there in the region. And this was quite crucial. And now just before I sort of hand things over to my colleagues, one other kind of perspective that we realized as we began to think about region was that the concerns that were emerging in Southeast Asia were not unique to Southeast Asia. And something really bizarre happened. I was in Mexico City in 2018. And I walked into the Museum Jumex, which is a really fantastic modern and contemporary art museum there. And I saw this exhibition called Memories of Underdevelopment. And I was excited and enamored at the same time, because there was this exhibition grappling with almost the same questions that we are asking in this exhibition, but from a Latin American perspective. And you realize that, gosh, we are not alone in this enterprise, and that we can rely on the work and generosity of colleagues from other parts of the world as well. So this is something perhaps we can also get at as we go along, that Southeast Asia is not coherent in and by itself, right? I mean, these things only become meaningful when they're seen in relation to the world and bigger debates around us. And I mean, dare I say, even with regards to more contemporary issues, which we can come to in a little while. But yes, I'd like to invite my colleagues to continue.
Yeah, so just picking up on one of the things that Mus mentioned, I think what really kind of brought this project to life truly was the generosity of our institutional partners and kind of peers and colleagues in the region. So, for example, for Bangkok, you know, it really began as a kind of series of conversations that we were having with the Birasri Institute's former director. And it required a lot of excavation on their part, you know, because the center has been, it's been closed since 1988, which is about 3 decades ago. And it was really this process of opening up these conversations that led us to kind of pull on the string and to really examine this history closely, because, you know, as we kind of accumulated accounts from these different individuals who were involved as artists or organizers, you really see that it's quite uncanny. Normally, at some point, someone's going to give the Institute a bad rep and say, oh, you know, it wasn't great for this reason. But what was very unusual, you know, in the case of the Institute was the fact that the accounts of it were always so shining and so positive, you know, that the artists always felt that, oh, you know, it was really the space that was needed as part of this Bangkok art scene, you know, amidst the kind of turmoil of urbanization and modernization. And so that's really, the stories. I think that's been our approach, that we always begin with the stories that are told to us and to kind of build on that, and with that, yeah.
Well, when we do comparative research, there's always a tension and anxieties that are produced from comparative research as opposed to research that are located within a specific locality, like a nation state, for example. And maybe, since we're talking about that in some ways, how do we conduct comparative research? It's actually something that I hold very dear, because a lot of my own research relies on a comparative approach. And what happens is also, when we do comparative approach, at the same time, we had to be very mindful that we are kind of researching, exhibiting the institutional histories of countries in the region. So not just Singapore, we're talking about the Philippines, we're talking about Thailand. And of course, what Jia Yun said, in that sense, through our research, we realized that many of the artists had a lot of nostalgic, wonderful memories of the Birasri Institute of Modern Art. But at the same time, they also mourned why it didn't continue, from 1988. And in some ways, the Bangkok Arts and Cultural Center, the BACC in Bangkok, is a kind of a continuation from BIMA, but not exactly at the same time. So that was something that we had to be very careful with, because in a sense, although we are in the region, but we are also, in a sense, having a certain distance from Bangkok, a certain distance from Manila at the same time, which is both a kind of advantage because we have that kind of distance, but also in some sense we have to be very aware that we are also addressing and engaging with art histories of other countries in the region. So I'm just wondering, maybe Jolene and Jia, you can share a bit, because both of you have done so much research into CCP and BIMA, to share your thoughts about this.
Okay, thank you. So, in order to begin understanding the activities of the 3 sites that we are studying, we really had to track the exhibitions and activities conducted by the organizers or curators and artists who are affiliated with these institutions. And so we had to go about, we had to start figuring out how to begin that process, where were the materials. And we realized that what we had was quite patchy. Some of these institutions were either defunct or no longer kept their archives, or they were scattered in the collections of different artists or organizers, or some of them were in their own respective cities, or not in English. So there were some challenges to this process, but nonetheless we began by going through and searching for catalogs, brochures, posters, and really began that process of documenting and writing down every single exhibition that we could find. Who were the artists, who were the curators, who were the guests of honors, who sponsored these exhibitions. All of this we started to track and chart down so that we can begin that process. We also started speaking, as Seow Yun said, to the artists who were affiliated to the 3 sites. And really trying to understand and get them to speak about the spaces and the physical sites in which they exhibited. And through that, they started talking about the importance of, say, the white cube and the white walls in which these spaces enabled the display of their works. Yeah. Sorry, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I think one of our earliest kind of archival expeditions was in Penang in 2016, where we all kind of descended upon Lim Chong Kiet's archive and really had this look at, the types of exhibitions that were happening at Alpha Gallery. So many of these materials are still in his possession, and he's seen the value of keeping these materials. So that was a very good starting point. But we still had to go through that process of ordering, of cataloging, of organizing. And that's also something that we had to do when we went to the Cultural Center of the Philippines, where there's an archive located within the CCP. But we still had to be selective, about the materials that we were choosing, because all the materials are there physically, but digitization has only been done to a limited extent by the Asia Art Archive. But you actually begin to see how agents like Lim Chong Kiet and actually also Ray Albano, who was the artist curator in charge of the CCP from 1971 to 1985, actually saw the value of this kind of archiving work. And I think that's why this archival component features so heavily within the exhibition as well, because it really gave us, it informed us of, the visual sensibilities of that time through design, but, also through the way that, curatorial notes were written or floor plans were drawn out. There was really this sense of making exhibitions looking very much at the now, but also looking towards the future, at someone looking back. So some of these curators, agents, actors, they really had a sense of foresight, about how their work would be perceived in the future. Yeah.
I think it's foresight, and it's also this sort of this need to record the contributions of one's generation. You see, and this is interesting because as we go through the process of acquiring these archival materials and begin to rely on newer techniques such as the digital, right? So here you have, say, for instance, an individual who gives you 50 catalogs of things that happen, and then we begin to sort of digitize these materials and repatriate them back here. So if you look around the exhibition, you see a lot of archival materials, but they're all reproductions, right? So this reproduction is enabled because of the kind of newer digital technologies that are available today. But one of the things that we also realize through these informal keepers, right, if we can call them that, Kun Chatvichai in Bangkok or Lim Chong Kiet in Penang, is that at the time, state institutions and archives, as we understand them today, did not operate in the way we understand them today. So there was a kind of a gap between what was happening in society and where these institutions were. These institutions were not able to keep up with the kind of movement, right, that these young people were sort of leading. So they decided to archive themselves with the hope that in 2016, a group of individuals would come and ask them about this, essentially, right? I mean, so when you talk to a lot of them, they would say this. They were like, oh gosh, I've been waiting for you for a long time, and here you are now. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but this was really this is where, I suppose, where one may track the curatorial, I suppose, that the ability to ask the question and then deal with the response, right? I mean, so one has to understand that there is a speaking subject out there, and that this subject may say something which you may or may not agree with or may not be able to live with even. But in this case, we were able to, and the result is the exhibition. So this is something that is also part of, I suppose, the title, right? I mean, at the end of the day, which is suddenly turning visible. In fact, at the opening, the guest of honor was Lim Chong Kiet, and he sort of ended his speech by saying that I am now suddenly visible, right? Because I mean, it's a question that he was waiting for somebody to ask. So I think this is part of the project, in a sense, to think about the archives, to think about these keepers, and I just wanted to perhaps ask, whether there are any anecdotes from the time that we wish to recall. And sometimes anecdotes allow us, this tremendous insight into why things are the way they are. Yeah.
So one kind of, I suppose, more recent interview that we did, because he was this figure that was kind of shrouded in mystery and somehow very hard to track down, but very luckily, the GM who runs his hotel was responding to our emails. And so this person is the architect who actually built the Birasri Institute, and that was built in 1974, which again is a long time ago. So we were very lucky to find out that he was still active in Thailand, but not in Bangkok. Rather, he's really established himself in Phuket. And finally, we managed to track him down and secure an interview with him. We were in Phuket, Seng Eugene and I, and we're surrounded by the lush beaches and the resort. And suddenly there comes in this very senior, gentleman, and he says like, "Oh, okay, you're here to talk to me about what again?" And then when we surfaced this building, we showed him pictures of the catalogs that we had found in Selapakuan University. He actually said, "Oh, wow, this building is still around. I didn't know, I thought that it would have been torn down by now." And so that process of, looking backwards actually happened, over the course of our interview and, over the lunch that, he very kindly hosted for us. And he was really starting to recall, that the use of materials at that time, the types of references that he was interested in, how he was roped into the project, which was really through a series of fortuitous kind of family connections, because his aunt, Princess Pantip Chumbot, is the one who bequeathed that long, narrow strip of land in a very premium part of Bangkok in the Lumpini district for the building of this dedicated Center for the Arts, which actually prior to that, I think had almost no precedent. So talking to Momtree was really, this exercise in visiting someone who was there and who was actively involved in this project. And he had all of these small quips, about how he even designed the building, which began with kind of like this splash of yellow paint, and then he kind of assembled the components of the building along it, because the site was so long and narrow that it really had to be designed in a way that brought the visitor into the space. So I think for Momtree, he was also kind of likewise, to our great kind of it was beneficial for us in that way that he was very pleasantly surprised that this building was still around, and he very actively kind of participated in talking about the building with us and sharing about its construction and its history. So these were some of one of many, I think, encounters that we had.
There's a real generosity here that I think we will pass around the catalog, and of course you can also, there's some reference copies around. There's real generosity that one experiences when one leaves Singapore. Momtree is just one example among so many others. So you'll see a long list of acknowledgements. And this is not just listing names for the sake of listing names. I mean, these individuals really came out and made all these efforts, right, at enabling the research, which cannot be taken for granted, even slightly, yeah.
So I think following on Jia Yun, when we managed to secure interview with Momtree was amazing, because it was, I think during the interview, during the interview, we then asked him, did anyone from Thailand ever ask you about the Birasri Institute of Modern Art? And he said no. So I think that was the moment. It's like, all these years, that building is it's not that it's not known, it's very well known among the Thai community, but I think it has been such a long time. And no one has actually tried to reach out to him. It's not the easiest, but we just try again and again. And I think we were lucky because we are Singaporeans. Maybe he got curious, why this group of Singaporeans keep on trying to reach me? When I'm in Phuket, I don't even want to go Bangkok. I'm in Phuket, I'm happy there. And that tenacity, I think, was really important, that curiosity, why we were interested. And he was then, in that interview, able to share with us, which is also transcribed in the catalog reader that we can pass around, is also to his thinking of the building itself, because he was trained in America, and when he came back, when he was designing the Birasri Institute of Modern Art, he also included a space for a library, which is now no longer there. I mean, he had that idea, so he created a space for it, but it was never used. And he also had the vision to create a very big loading bay door. So he was thinking about, yes, we need to bring artworks in. So a lot of his thinking was really very forward thinking about how an art center needs to be run. And he brought a lot of Bauhaus thinking into his design as well. He had that spiral staircase. So Jia Yun and myself also, visited the space prior to interviewing him, because it's there, right? And we had a good sense, of how the space looked like. Yeah.
I just want to draw perhaps Jolene into the conversation by sort of maybe moving from Bangkok to Manila, because whilst there is, I would say, a general consensus in Bangkok and in Singapore that these spaces were important and crucial and really did present new ideas within the kind of social context of the 1970s. I think the Cultural Center of the Philippines, on the other hand, was always contested, right? Contested by different communities, contested by different artists, contested even by different visions of how the state could fund and operate it. And perhaps, Jolene, you want to talk a little bit about this, about discovering these different fault lines and navigating through them as well.
Okay, maybe I'll begin with why we're also sitting here, which are two, right in front of two works, first by the Kaisahan and one by Raymundo Albano. And in some ways, they shed light on two schools of artistic thought that were emerging in Manila at the time, which is social realism, represented by the Kaisahan, and also the conceptualist mode of working, which Albano was very much at the forefront of and championing at the CCP. And as Moose said, these are really kind of two schools that emerge, and often the debate around between what was avant-garde at the time centered on very binarist frameworks, which kind of hark back to certain modernist rules of engagement with art. So one was whether you can have art for art's sake, or the other was the argument that art should be a mirror for society. And of course, the situation in Manila is such that these are not so binary and not so simplistic. So while studying the CCP, for instance, we realized that the role of the state couldn't be ignored, right? So we had the Kaisahan were obviously left out because the state really had a way of choosing and promoting art that they wanted, while also repressing other artistic voices that they did not wish to be promoted and to represent Philippines. And of course, the Kaisahan would be left out because they were fundamentally anti-establishment. Now, then we also have the conceptualists, who were in many ways also questioning whether the art as the idea of an establishment, or whether you can have art, they were questioning institutions of artistic authority at the same time, all the while doing this while they were within a grand project of the Marcos regime itself, which is the CCP. And then on the other hand, you also have Imelda Marcos, who favored certain styles of art, such as abstraction, or certain traditional depictions of rural life, or traditional folklore in the Philippines. And so any kind of question about what was avant-garde in Manila had to deal with the role of the institution and had to be necessarily much more complicated than this. So these were some of the things that we were trying to deal with, how to move beyond this binary framework of understanding what was avant-garde in the Philippines. And by putting these two works together in close proximity, we were trying to allude to that tension. But I also think that through the archives that we present, we also wanted to show that there's another way of thinking about how the avant-garde began in Manila, and that is a certain kind of tendency towards, or a critical position against the repression of humanity in Manila. And you can see this with, say, the Kaisahan, but also a certain sense of relational quality in the conceptual mode of working in, say, Albano. For instance, how this work is necessarily participatory. And in those texts that were produced by Albano, he talks about how coming together and certain festivals inherent, or this shows a certain inherent collectivity fundamental in Manila's traditions itself. Yeah.
I guess what's avant-garde was actually a highly contested kind of idea in itself, and maybe at some point even rejected. I would even hesitate to propose, because if you think about the social realists, like the Kaisa Han, were they avant-garde in their own way? It's something to be considered. They might even have rejected the whole notion of the avant-garde as something that was very Western-centric. And of course, the term itself is derived from a military term, being avant-garde. And whether or not that's something that they kind of took on board, it's something to be, that needs unpacking. And we can't kind of accept it like, oh, that was what all the artists were kind of striving to do, to be avant-garde necessarily. I think that maybe needs to be more nuanced in our thinking. So with that as well, when we're looking at artists like Ray Albano, with this work, step on sand and to make footprints, It's in 1974. He wrote it as a set of instructions just to make a sandbox in which at least 4 people can step into it at any one point in time. So it was just a set of instructions, and he mailed it to Tokyo in 1974 as part of the Tokyo Print Biennale. And he thought he would never be accepted, but he got accepted and he won an award, and then he showed the work back in 1975 in the CCP. And it's a kind of a bit of a fluxus kind of a work to it, because it's kind of like mail art in that sense, mailing a set of instructions to make a sandbox with 4 people. Of course, we have expanded it here. You can have more than 4 people in it, but nonetheless still fulfills his instructions. And of course, we talked to his sister as well before kind of remaking this work. So this notion of the conceptual, this notion of this kind of being socially engaged as being dichotomous is not true. And I think this exhibition in a way challenges those binaries in some sense, that works that were conceptual perhaps could also be socially engaged. Works produced by the social realists obviously have a conceptual component to it as well. So I think these binaries need to be kind of more nuanced in our thinking.
I'm just going to maybe try and ask a different question, and I know we've talked about this quite extensively. If you look around at the wall text, especially, one word keeps coming up, which is developmentalism, right? And developmentalism is essentially this kind of assumption, and of course I'm going to grossly simplify it here, is that in the aftermath of the colonial, or after independence is achieved, how will these societies literally develop, right? Both socially, culturally, economically. And there is a mantra that a lot of the politicians at the time and a lot of the artists and architects also adopt is 50 years in 5. That whatever took the West 50 years, we will do it in 5 years. We are much smarter. We have more people, and we've been oppressed for so long that we are now able to work in any conditions, right? So like kind of bricoleurs. No, we can. Doesn't matter. You give me a piece of plank, and I'll try and make a boat out of it, right? So that sort of idea. It doesn't matter what we need. It's about what we have, right? And to make do with it. And in a sense, one kind of feels that tendency within this exhibition too, and in the other space as well, And perhaps also to complicate the question of the avant-garde, it was likely also this notion that one had to do away with. And quite a few of the architects actually do discuss this in the catalog, in the interviews, is to do away with decadence. Because the colonial had been about excess, it's about building, and it's about using so much resources in order to complete tasks, that now we had very limited resources and we just had to make do with what we had, right? And I think that's a very contemporary question today as well, I mean, think about sand, right? Sand is the second most traded commodity in the world, right? It's actually rare. Can you believe that? Sand is rare. It's not so prevalent and accessible anymore. So in a sense, I think perhaps the project also has a kind of undertone, right, that begins to think about some of these bigger issues. I mean, just behind you are coffins for Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, the great promoters of neoliberalism, and of course, our own Soviet heritage, right, so to speak. I mean, it's Soviet heritage, it's the world's heritage, because we all think of 1989 as a very important moment. So, yeah, perhaps maybe we can talk a little bit about this. I mean, some of the more contemporary concerns, no, that emerge out of this particular project, even though it's focused on the 70s. Yeah.
I mean, I think, one of the things that continue to undergird, the making of institutions is this idea of money and where does money come from. And, even in looking at this idea of patronage, which is something that we highlight as part of our archival display, is that actually the nature of patronage for all three institutions is very different. So for example, for Alpha, it's really artists coming together, pooling resources, and creating a kind of free entry zone where you can really kind of work on your art practice in a very unencumbered way. And then for the Birasri Institute, it was also different because it consisted of a kind of crowdfunding across, private, public, royal, American patrons for over 10 years, to accrue the building funds required in order to finally, buy things like sand and concrete to have the building constructed. So yeah, as in that, I mean, in Singapore, I suppose, looking at institutions always involves, this element of looking at the state. But really looking at these ideas that came up in the 70s, it's really different models for institutional building. And, the CCP, of course, now has so many have come out of it to say, alongside the Kaisahan, that yes, this institution has a history of having this unrestricted kind of backing from the Marcos regime, but it also enabled the kind of realization of these very powerful visions of a city, at a post-colonial turn, really, and that in itself also was an incredibly kind of powerful and lasting gesture. So yeah, looking back at the avant-garde, traditionally, because all our definitions come from the West, the avant-garde is always about challenging the institution. But what happens when the institution is incubating the avant-garde, So these were some of the tensions that really came up and that we had to address, but maybe also challenge us to think about different definitions of the avant-garde that are more specific to this region, as opposed to kind of just tacking on definitions from elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about developmentalism, brings to mind David Mandela's work, like Kumbun series, and that was done from 71 to 72. And what he did was really just to have like newspaper cuttings or cuttings from magazines, talking about social, political, economic issues, exactly issues that are now being discussed, as products of neoliberal capitalism, right? The issues that are brought up from there, issues concerning, Islamophobia, the international dust market, corruption, censorship. These are all issues that have been addressed in the Kumbun series. So if you have not seen that work, please do see it. It's in the Concourse Gallery 1, the Niang Kongsi Concourse Gallery 1 space. And he did it in 71 and 72, and that book was actually shown in Documenta as well. So we didn't manage to show the full series of the work because it's like comprising of more than 100 pieces. We're only showing 28 in this exhibition. The rest of it is actually in his archive, I guess, in Berlin. Hopefully one day we are able to show that full extent of it. But this whole kind of idea about developmentalism was already being challenged by artists like David Mandela in a very socially engaged but conceptual way. So, that comes back to my earlier kind of point about how the conceptual is not necessarily disconnected with being socially engaged. A work by David Mandela's Kumbun series, for example, is a very conceptual type of work that, has this text that he writes that interjects, into those newspaper and magazine cuttings that he has selected. That also, is very critical at the same time. One thing maybe Musme, I like to talk about is, of course, in the whole curatorial process includes inclusions and exclusions. I mean, that's how, in a way, I think we should talk about, and maybe this platform allows us to talk about it. Because you have seen what we have included, but of course, what is invisible is what we have excluded, in some sense.
For many reasons at times, right? But one thing I want to also just mention, and perhaps can ask Jolene to comment on this, is the discovery of all these artists, quite a few of them, right, whom we have very little information about today, right? So they were obviously operating in this kind of very, at times, socially engaged or conceptually charged manner. And we discovered all these works in the collection here from the 70s, but know very little about them because they somehow left the scene. You know? So in a sense, its art is not a kind of a given, right? I mean, people leave the world of art as well, and you suddenly realize that, gosh, the art world is actually quite limited in scope because you can actually leave it. You know, and the ability to leave it and disappear, right? And live another life outside of art is quite fantastic. I mean, there's one work in particular that we have, yeah.
Yeah, so the work Mustafa is referring to is Tay Tian Chong's Metaform, which is in the other main gallery. It's a kind of painting that then leaps out into the viewer space. It's kind of a steel structure, right? And it's by the artist Tay Tian Chong, who was born in Penang. He was trained in UK, in Loughborough and Liverpool, and then he took up several teaching positions, both in Malaysia and then in Singapore. And then he spends his time in Singapore teaching as the head of the three-dimensional art department at the UWC in Singapore. And at the same time, also is very active in Alpha Gallery. So he shared a studio space with Teo Eng Seng, Eng Tao, Anthony Poon, Yo Ho Kun, and so on. And it's very interesting because when I spoke to Teo Eng Seng, he also shares an anecdote with me, and he says that he really believes that the relief paintings that Anthony Poon is so renowned for today actually began first with Tay Tian Chong. So Tay Tian Chong was actually in the studios at the Alpha Gallery already working and on innovating on the flat surface of the canvas and creating these reliefs. But yet today we still know very little about Tay Tian Chong. Yeah. And he's still not very much visible in the art canon of Singapore.
We also tried to contact him.
Yes, and we tried contacting him, and we believe that, I mean, he has passed on and passed away in New Zealand, but we can't confirm this with the family at all.
And this is actually not a unique tale. I mean, this is a recurring story that happens, especially in this part of the world. And each time, I mean, you know, I'd be a millionaire. If I had $10 each time I encounter this, but really, I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it's also quite a wake-up call that the world of art is just that. There is this entire world beyond it, and somehow we need to find and develop ways to engage with all these other realities, and that's sort of what this space is also doing, in a sense, that we must not lock ourselves down, to continuously think about what's happening outside and within, to really develop something meaningful. I have one last question, is for Jayon. This work behind us, which has actually been making a lot of noise, and we often query, you know, to be in the city is to live with all sorts of noises and smells, right? I mean, and hence we thought we'll just leave it on rather than turn it down, right? So I hope it was not too much of a nuisance, but you want to just talk a little bit more? It's quite comic, actually, some of the stuff.
Yeah, so, I mean, true to its title, you know, Song for the Dead art exhibition is actually a song, but it's maybe not a very melodious one. And that's precisely the artist's point. It's really this cacophony of happenings, events, readings that are all happening simultaneously, during the launch of this happening performance / installation by the artist Kamon Pausawat, who is incidentally also a professor at the Chulalongkorn University, teaching in the Fine Arts Department. And when we spoke to him about this, we asked one question and he would kind of give us 10 paragraphs of detail. So that's really, the process of reconstruction was also through some of these accounts that were told to us. But I think what was actually most interesting also about this particular exhibition is a few things. So first and foremost is the fact that he was a very young artist, just returning from the United States at the time, and he was given this entire space to do a monographic exhibition. So that's about, almost, I think larger than this space, like 100 plus square meters of space. And the other thing was that, he spoke to the artistic director of BIMA at the time, Kun Chatvichai, and said, if I want to do what I really want to do, is it okay that I don't tell you exactly what I'm going to do? And Kun Chatvichai kind of paused and then he went, okay. So he went on to kind of plaster the entire wall of the Birasri Institute with these cheap Xeroxes of conceptual art manifestos, kind of surfacing them but also kind of cheapening them. And he then proceeded to fill the center of the space with junk that he had kind of retrieved from neighboring kind of construction sites. And then he proceeded to create this thing which he called a sound sculpture, which was basically like making noise in the dark from the back to the front of the space, and then having his students read out manifestos of, surrealism, Marxism, all at the same time. And he deliberately wanted all of these people to not be professional readers, poets, they were all kind of students, amateurs. And what he really wanted to provoke with this exhibition was this idea that, what is ugly and what is beautiful, and why hasn't this question been raised before? That's partly because, the establishment in Bangkok at the time had very much been quite centered around the art academy, Silapakon, and he wanted to kind of break through and to kind of provoke a kind of response that was outside of those norms. And so 1985 was the year that this installation was held, but it also was the year of many kind of different happenings and events, including Vasan's sickness age. So it really became a year, brought together by different agents in a very unorchestrated way of questioning. And all of that questioning kind of really happened at the Birasri Institute of Modern Art. So I think that's precisely, the elasticity of the institution that we're also interested in, that it doesn't just look at the modern or, make the modern a dogma, but really kind of opens up that question to artists who, felt that the current solutions are inadequate. Yeah.
Maybe we should open up at this point to anyone who would like to ask questions from the audience.
Even comments.
Yeah, comments. If you have seen the exhibition, there's something that you would like us to clarify.
You can also shout at us. I mean, it's perfectly fine. We're already seated in a sandbox.
Yeah, don't like the show. And I think we have a mic. Do we have a mic to pass around? No.
We use this. Yeah, we can pass it.
You're going to go now. We have.
I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but looking at the work that you've found or shown or kind of brought back to life, it all just seems much, much braver and more interesting than anything I've seen anywhere else in the last couple of years, with the one exception being work that was produced by prisoners that I saw last year. Where's the edge gone? Because what's in that other room is either in terms of subject matter or in terms of just playing with form. Just everybody seems to be taking chances, and there seems to be very few people in the current era taking the same chances.
It's a So it's a very astute observation, actually. I mean, I can respond. Yeah, where has the edge gone, right? So, I mean, without perhaps remarking on what's happening at the moment, one thing that we discover as part of the research process, and you can sense that, right, as you walk around the rooms and in this room as well, but more so in the other gallery, is that that entire generation just was in a kind of a constant state of remaking and unmaking and making and remaking, and they just refused, absolutely refused to be locked down to a particular style, right? So you can see it, you know. You have Balinese peasant painting next to hard edge, next to something rather absurd, kind of popping out of the wall using acrylic. You know, it's really, if there was ever a way to think about the industrial in a kind of a very Southeast Asian quirky manner, that's it. That's it. That's it. It's right there as a kind of a palimpsest. And I know we discussed this extensively, and we realized that if we had attempted to create conventional categories of exhibition making, we would have literally erased this, because we could have created clusters which are a lot more conventional and a lot more guided, right? And slightly even probably more pedagogic, right? Oh, okay, now I get it. Like there was this guy doing abstraction, and then there was somebody else interested in peasant painting, but we didn't do that. We had to resist. We had to resist it because that's actually what was happening. They just refused to see. I mean, at the Birasri Institute of Modern Art, it was fantastic. There's all these images where you have an exhibition on something, let's say a series of Cyrillus paintings, followed by an exhibition on relics of the Buddha, right? I mean, like it's how do you call it? Uneven.
Uneven, yeah.
Yeah, it's uneven.
If we think about the 70s, and this exhibition highlights the 70s and 80s in particular, if you look across Southeast Asia, including other parts of Asia, but just by looking at Southeast Asia, you see certain similarities across. For example, the student protest movements that were happening across Southeast Asia in the 70s, the Manila, first quarter storm, second quarter storm, third quarter storm in UP, University of the Philippines, the Thammasat University massacre, 76. But from 73 to 76, there were a whole series of student protests that were happening. The Malari incident in Jakarta, 1974, also, it was really university students who were protesting. So and that, of course, we can trace to 68 in Europe, what was happening then. But nonetheless, what happened in 70s was really remarkable. I'm not even sure. Maybe we are at that somewhat turning point now. I'm not sure. But looking at Hong Kong, for example, what's happening over there is what I'm drawing from. I'm not sure we are at a turning point, but it's too early to say. But what we know for sure in the 70s was a particular period. But why that happened was because if you look at the political situation in the 70s across Southeast Asia, there was a whole series of countries under either martial law or under some form of authoritarianism. But if you look at the New Order under Suharto, right, in Indonesia, 70s, of course. Marcos, we've already talked about it, right? We looked at Myanmar, right? It's also under military dictatorship at that point. And Myanmar also had student protest movements in the 70s. It's not said often, but Yangon University was closed at least 3 times. I mean, how often do you hear a university being closed? It was closed at least 3 times. And then we have Thailand was under military dictatorship in the 70s. If we extend it a bit further out, Taiwan was under martial law. So was South Korea at the same time. So if we look at the situation in the 70s, I think that sets somewhat the context for what kind of like resulted in artists having that kind of desire and urgency to respond to it. What you said as agia kind of practices. So.
Older conventions are being either reworked or really very strenuously a lot of pressure is being applied, you see, and something new hopefully would emerge from it. And it did, it actually did. I mean, it explains so much as we understand these three cities today.
But one of the challenges is some of these more experimental works have also been lost because they are installations like, Cygnus Age, Vasan Sitikit's work, or Apinan Pochananda's How to Explain Art to a Bangkok Cock. All those were lost.
All the works here have been...
So we had to remake them. And to remake, of course, requires resources, it requires working with the artists if they're still alive, and all the other questions and problems that comes from remaking works, which is another discussion in itself. But it's something that we deal with, right? We had to deal with in this exhibition. And how we dealt with it was to remake them as much as we can in discussions with the artists. Thankfully, most of them still alive, of course, except for Ray Albano, whom we are now sitting on.
Maybe we can take another question if there is one. Yeah.
So I find it interesting. You guys talked about that Bima and Alpha Gallery were quite celebrated, but eventually they ended the operation anyway. And in contrast, CCP faced or has faced a lot of resistance and criticisms and all that, but they are still running now. So, of course, I can imagine there must be a lot of reasons and explanations. But what I see is that, does it mean, or are there any, can you say that art institutions actually need certain resistance or challenges or to keep it relevant or something like that? I find it quite interesting whether you guys have something.
It's very hard to say. It's indeed of a strange coincidence that Alpha and Bima closed in the same year, 1988, and CCP has continued ever since. But I think for Alpha, for Bima, it was very clear. It was because of the death of Princess Panti, and so that resulted in a kind of a lack of clarity in the funding for Bima. Yeah, so that was kind of quite clear. Alpha was also due to some financial situation that emerged in the late 80s, which they sort of never recovered from. But I must say at this point, it was really quite amazing for an artist cooperative like the Alpha Gallery, because they had no funding from the National Arts Council, simply because it didn't exist back then. And they had no funding from the state as well. It was all just artists coming together with Lim Chong Kiat as the catalyst, kind of self-organizing exhibitions, and then through the sale of some of their works, they'll help to kind of continue to fund the operations of the Alpha Gallery. So it's not true that artists are not good managers. They managed it really well for so many years with no funding support. They couldn't write a funding paper to NAC to ask for a seed grant. Like nowadays, you can do that. And it was not possible. So it was quite amazing how they did it.
The reason why I was laughing was, the irony is not lost on me. Yeah? 4 curators from the National Gallery being asked about institutions being challenged, right? And maybe I try to answer also from a different perspective. Yes, I think so. Absolutely. Why not, right? And whilst I think institutions themselves need to operate with degrees of transparency and accountability, it is also the role of individuals working in the institutions to ensure or at least enable, right, conversations to happen in a very meaningful manner. And I think the 3 case studies that we have presented in the exhibition achieve that to varying degrees of effectiveness. Yeah, even at the CCP, which was the most fraught, I think, or the most contested, right? I think open discussions did happen to some extent. The fact that Albano worked there didn't necessarily mean or equate to the fact that he agreed with everything that the regime stood for, if you know what I mean. So I think one has to find nuance or approach this with some degree of care, you know, or caution even. And the project has been about that too, you know, finding those gray zones, right? And not walking away from them, but to discuss them. I mean, even with somebody like Imelda Marcos, no, I mean, we realize obviously there are the what are today rather cliches, huh? But at the same time, there was a kind of a cultural process that was initiated. Whether one agrees with it or not is a different issue, but there was some kind of a cultural process and conversation that was initiated, right? So I think this question of nuance, I think, is also crucial, along with some degree or large degrees of transparency and accountability. So yeah, I think the pressure is as crucial as the work that is done inside as much as outside.
I think looking at it, trying to answer your question again, is I think institutions like collectives, like artist collectives, exist particularly to address certain urgent issues at that time. That's one way to look at it. So if you look at Alpha Gallery, for example, in the 70s, there were no institutions, you know, particularly to support the arts, especially visual arts in Singapore, until the National Museum Art Gallery, but that was in '76. So Alpha, in a sense, was earlier than that. So I think artists saw that gap that they needed to fill, a space for them to meet, a space for them to exhibit, a space for them to meet patrons or, you know, other artists or musicians and so on. So in a very kind of interdisciplinary way to share ideas was a space they didn't have in Singapore at that time. So I think in a spirit of just do it yourself, you know, say, why don't we do it, you know, and they formed the Alpha Gallery for that reason as well, because there was no art market. They created one, and you can't create a market out of nothing. You need to exhibit your works to create a market, to say who are these important artists, you know, what are their works, you know, so they had solo exhibitions for artists, and that gave them a lot of exposure. And because architects, being architects, are very well connected, they bring in these people, you know, including, and they became ambassadors and so on. So these are people who then supported these artists. So I think that's one reason, I think, and that maybe changed later on, because then the state became much more involved in supporting the arts and funding and so on. Although I wouldn't say that completely explains, but I think that's one of the reasons.
I once asked Lim Chong Ket, what does it mean to collectivize? And he said, well, just get on with it. That's what it means to collectivize, you know. So that's sort of very apt, no? Just get on with it, get it done. That was the kind of ethos, I suppose.
Was that the same for Bima, you feel, for Chia Yun, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of the reliance, I suppose, on funding that was coming in, because part of the reason why it was so successful and why there was so much buy-in, it was a bit of a double-edged sword, where if a student group, you know, wanted to do something, then rates to do things were heavily subsidized, you know, and as opposed to venue rental that, you know, would occasionally rent out to, you know, orchestras who would want to use the space. So it's really about this kind of balance of, you know, how do you make a space, a public space, a not-for-profit space, but still keep afloat, you know. So in a sense, there was this element of charity that really kind of drove it forward, and that kind of almost altruistic nature, both in its spirit and also in its funding, you know, that made it, I think, very remarkable, but also in a sense also very vulnerable. Yeah, but I mean, talking about CCP as an exception, I think when Jolene and I spoke to some of the art historians and artists, then they do talk about the transitioning years and how that was very tough, because basically from the Marcos regime and, you know, having those types of resources compared to becoming kind of like a public truly public institution, which means that, you had to, lean and mean, you had to submit your record statements, your employees had to have degrees and stuff, all of these considerations suddenly were fed back in, but there was enough of also like a community of artists who stayed behind as organizers to kind of see the CCP through, because it's also important to remember that the CCP was also the home to many cutting-edge kind of performance groups, ballet groups, music groups, performance, theater, drama, and in fact, although the artists who exhibited at the CCP have such a long-lasting legacy now, including its collection, the space that was actually given within the CCP to show art was actually really small. It was small, but in the memories of all the artists, it made such a indelible impression. So yeah, it definitely wasn't without strain, that it prevailed as an institution. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is all the time we have today. Feel free to stay back if you have any questions for the curators. Could you join me in thanking them, please? Thank you.